Hi. I'd like to take a bit of a detour from Westminster politics and instead talk to you today about financial vulnerability in government debt, and specifically what we in Indesser are doing to use data and analytics to identify vulnerable customers. The topic of vulnerability, I'm sure, won't be a new one to anyone in the room, and you may even recognise some of the quotes on the wall behind me. They represent a fraction of what regulators, government departments, and industry are saying about vulnerability. Working in the debt industry, as I do, puts us very close to vulnerable customers, and I describe it as we have a high likelihood of interacting with these customers, as well as a high risk of detriment if we're not working in the right way. But our position also gives us a tremendous opportunity to effect some real change. So before I go any further in the presentation, I just want to give a bit of background on who Indesser are and what we do. So Indesser are a joint venture between TDX Group, a private sector debt specialist, and the Cabinet Office. We were set up in 2015, and since then we've been providing a wide range of debt management services to government and to the wider public sector. Okay. Our approach, if you like, to debt resolution can be simplified into the following 4 stages. So firstly, a government department will pass us a file of in-debt customers. Secondly, we'll use a range of data sources to enrich that file, understand that customer's circumstances and what the most appropriate treatment path is to resolve their debt. Thirdly, the customers will be passed to one of our panel of debt collection agencies to execute that strategy, which will lead to resolution of the debt. To date, most of our effort in vulnerability and addressing vulnerability has been focused on this part, and for good reason, because this is where collections agents working on our behalf actually interact with customers. But the challenge for me and for my team was, what can we do with data to drive better interactions and hence better outcomes for vulnerable customers? Can we do anything? And because I'm a strong believer in the power of data, I said, yes, of course we can do something here. And the seed of an idea in my head was, surely we must be able to use data and intelligence to identify customers that we believe are vulnerable. And if we could do that, then what different treatment paths can we design that are better suited to those customers' needs? So to start to turn that intention into some results, we did a lot of research, a lot of reading, and one of the things we found was this from the 4 characteristics of potential vulnerability that the FCA talk about in a number of their publications. And looking at this, what we quickly realized is that we have a lot more data on these 2 characteristics than we do on these 2. And so in order to deliver a data-led solution, we decided to focus on financial capability and financial resilience. And so when you hear me talking about financial vulnerability, it's those 2 characteristics in particular I'm talking about. Okay. So we have the challenge. We've now got the scope. What we need to do is crack on and build a model, right? Well, the slight challenge is that when we look at our historic data that we typically use to build a model, we don't know exactly who's vulnerable and who's not. And the reason we don't is because we don't speak to every customer. In fact, the research tells us we're less likely to speak to vulnerable customers than we are other customers. So for you model build enthusiasts out there, what that means is we don't have a really crisp dependent variable. So we can't use regression techniques, for instance, to build a model. So what did we do instead? So we went back to the data. The team scoured over 150 credit bureau characteristics to identify links between those data points and financial vulnerability. And they did so with their experience and knowledge, and also the data points we do have available. Contacts, vulnerability where we have identified it, as well as some department-specific data points. And what they found was these 6 behaviours that we think show indication of financial vulnerability. So the first poor management of the basics is a really good example of how we can use data to identify financial capability specifically. So an example of that is an individual who might use an overdraft for relatively low value borrowing, right? Particularly where that's an unauthorized overdraft use, and particularly where they have other cheaper options available. Secondly, high utilization of credit points very clearly to low financial resilience. For instance, a customer who's at or above the credit limit across their credit cards. So I won't speak in detail about the other four behaviours, apart from to say that we've got a really good balance, I think, of leading indicators that show how a customer is behaving in the present and how that links to vulnerability, as well as lagging indicators, so an indication of what someone's done in the past that points to their likelihood of vulnerability in the present. From these behaviours, the team defined 18 signals of financial vulnerability, so 18 specific examples of those behaviours that we coded up, and then set a threshold where when we see 3 or more of these signals, we will, in this model, define that individual as financially vulnerable. And after creating this, the question for me was, and the slightly nerve-wracking questions, we couldn't use standard model build techniques, was how well does this work? What kind of customers might this model identify? I've not got a ton of time to show lots of analyses or charts, but I just want to show 4 numbers that I think answer that question. So this model identifies 5% of a typical debt portfolio as being financially vulnerable. We are 60% less likely to speak to customers in that segment. They are 80% less likely to make a payment. And when we look at liquidation rates, so the proportion of the debt that's paid back, that's 90% lower. Or we put it another way, we're less likely to speak to these customers. The ones that we do speak to are less likely to pay, and the ones that do pay can only pay back less. So I think that tells me that we're onto something with this model. But how do we use it? So I'm super excited to put this model to use in our collection strategies. But of course, it's not just the model and the segmentation that's important. It's the collection strategy that we pair with that that's really key. And we currently have a tender in the market to identify those suppliers who can deliver that right treatment path for this customer group. Even while that work is going on, the team are super excited about where we go next with this, with the model build specifically. And for me, the biggest opportunity is to broaden out the model to include all 4 characteristics of vulnerability, looking at data on health and major life events. So very sensitive data sets. And I think, therefore, the challenge for us is how do we use that data, those various data sources, in a way that's legal, in a way that's ethical, and in a way that genuinely improves outcomes for financially vulnerable customers. Thank you very much for listening.